I rise today as chairman of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee to highlight the urgency and importance of addressing sequestration. These imminent cuts will have real impacts on the environment and on thousands of jobs related to infrastructure investment and environmental protection. The reductions required by sequestration will also come on top of other deep cuts that these programs have already absorbed over the last 2 years. Even though Interior bill programs make up less than 3% of total federal discretionary spending, we've already seen more than $2 billion in cuts to environmental programs over the past 2 years. And if sequestration moves forward, it means an additional $1.6 billion in across-the-board cuts to the Interior bill. We have already been forced to take $1 billion out of water infrastructure funding, and under sequestration, EPA's state clean and drinking water revolving fund programs will lose another $130 million. In addition to potential public health impacts, these cuts will mean 7,000 fewer construction jobs, just at a time we need to put more people to work. And these cuts will be made worse by more than $50 million in additional reductions to grants to help states run their environmental agencies, including supporting clean water programs. The consequences will fall squarely on communities like Lowe's in my home state of Rhode Island that are already struggling to keep pace with their infrastructure needs. Just as we cannot place the burden of our nation's growing financial debt on our children, we cannot place the burden of repairing our failing infrastructure on the next generation also. We have immediate needs that require immediate investment. I'm also concerned about cuts to our nation's land management agencies, including the National Park Service, which is slated for $130 million in cuts. Sequestration will affect all 398 of our national parks, from the largest to the smallest. It means fewer seasonal personnel to assist visitors, which means fewer jobs. And it also means fewer visitor services, more facility closures, and less upkeep and maintenance of our nation's premier public lands. These cuts are obviously bad news for the millions of people who visit our national parks every year, but it's worth pointing out that these cuts are also bad news for local economies that depend on national parks. Nationwide, parks support more than 250,000 private jobs and contribute almost $13 billion annually to local economies. Even Roger Williams National Memorial in my home state of Rhode Island attracted nearly 51,000 visitors in 2011, with non-local visitors adding more than $3.2 million to the local economy. And the Roger Williams National Memorial is one of the smallest of our national parks. Even this small park is a major factor in my community. These closures and cutbacks will certainly affect the bottom line of communities across this nation if fewer families are able to visit and enjoy our federal lands and our national parks. Sequestration will also impact programs that generate revenue for the federal government. The Interior Department oversees onshore and offshore energy development and expects those activities will be slowed dramatically. The trial of the 2010 Gulf of Mexico oil spill and my colleague from Louisiana was so effective and so critical to the response of the federal government for a home state of Louisiana, the whole Gulf Coast. But they're on trial today to allocate liability. It's an important reminder of how critical these activities are to prevent these natural disasters rather than somehow try to recoup losses after the fact. And yet the department will be forced to furlough employees who conduct lease sales, issue permits for new development, conduct environmental reviews, and inspect operations. That's no way to run a railroad or a national Department of Interior. These cuts could result in 300 fewer onshore oil and gas leases in western states and processing delays for the 550 offshore exploration and development plans expected this year. Companies may decide that development isn't worth it because of the uncertainty, which will lead to less production and small royalties for the Treasury. In other words, the cuts required by sequestration could actually end up costing the government money rather than saving money, and could take away from the developing ability of the United States to become more and more energy independent by production within the country rather than buying petrochemicals and petroleum products from overseas. Madam President, the sequester is a real problem for environmental programs in the Interior bill and throughout nearly all government programs. But there are ways to prevent this meat-axe approach to addressing the budget. Indeed, Democrats have put forward a specific and clear plan, half cuts and half revenue, to replace the sequester. Quite simply, we've put a plan forward that puts jobs first by cutting specific wasteful spending and closing dubious tax loopholes. This bill gives the economy more breathing room by offsetting the sequester with smart policy that should be enacted even if there was no threat of sequester. Let's be clear what's at stake here. The director of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office recently testified that the 2013 sequester will result in 750,000 lost jobs and a 0.6% reduction in GDP for 2013. Lost jobs and lower growth. That's what sequester is going to produce. I don't think the people of Rhode Island or anyone else in the United States wants the Congress to support policies that mean fewer jobs. We have a crisis in Rhode Island, a jobs crisis, that should be addressed before anything else. Now, we hear from the other side of the Capitol that we must have a sequester to address the budget. But, Madam President, over the last 2 years, as my colleagues have pointed out, we have slashed the deficit by $2.4 trillion over the next 10 years. The bulk of that reduction, $1.7 trillion, has come through spending cuts. We have been cutting. Indeed, my Republican colleagues have repeatedly held the economy hostage in order to cut spending that benefits the vast majority of Americans and protects tax cuts that benefit the wealthy few. That's not economically efficient, and that's not fair. We see the results. In my home state of Rhode Island, 10.2% unemployment rate, unacceptably high. 12.3 million Americans across the country still unemployed. This Republican agenda of protecting the wealthiest and not investing in job creation is out of step with the majority of Americans. Most Americans would prefer right now that we address the crisis of jobs. And by the way, more people working means we also address the deficit. They pay taxes, they don't qualify unemployment compensation, they don't apply for other programs. That is the smart way and the way we should pursue to deal, at least in part, with our deficit problems. We should not be jeopardizing our economy. We should not be allowing these loopholes to exist that allow multinational corporations to ship our jobs overseas. We should not be having loopholes that give benefits to oil and gas companies that are recording historic profits, all ultimately at the expense of investing in programs that will put Americans to work in the parks, in infrastructure, in sewage systems throughout our country. So more austerity, and that's what this is all about, especially in the form of these draconian, reckless cuts, will hurt the economy. We should be working to create jobs. And we should also recall that we are here today as the legacy of the Republican brinksmanship of threatening to allow the United States for the first time in its history to default on its national debt. That's why we're here. Let's not forget that. This was a means to avoid what would have been a catastrophic default, the first in our history. Now we have the opportunity to change course, to invest in our people and invest in growth and do it in a balanced way. We can't cut our way to prosperity. The President said that. These contractionary policies, this austerity that the Republicans are urging upon us, will reduce economic growth at a time we need to expand economic growth, not only to give people jobs, but to truly address the deficit and in a responsible, reasonable way. Now, we've come through the threats to default on the debt. We've come through other proposals. Now it's a time to have a balanced approach, and I urge that this balanced approach be adopted quickly.